Hello everyone. Today's video I will be talking about this claim that if God is omniscient, meaning that he knows everything, it means that he knows what shirt I'm going to wear tomorrow and what I'm going to have for lunch tomorrow. And not just tomorrow, but the day after that and the day after that and so on. In other words, if God is omniscient, he knows everything, he knows the future, which means that the future has to be predetermined, which then again implies that there's no free will. And this will of course now be a bit of a problem from Christian point of view, because for many free will is a key part of the Christian faith, and therefore the Christian faith is sort of self-refuting, because Christianity also claims that God is omniscient, which means then that it contradicts itself. It can't be true. Now, the thing is that this claim, I see it being made quite frequently on social media, and I find that a bit surprising, because while there are certain questions that are really difficult, such as the existence of God or existence of free will in general, or the problem of evil, where they are difficult to the extent that I think if you take the best expert in the world, and obviously I'm not an expert on these things, but if you take the best expert on these topics, and no matter how firmly they hold their view, even the best expert, I think, will have to resort to a bit of faith and acknowledge the uncertainty, because we can't answer certain questions with sort of in an absolutely conclusive manner. But this question is not one of those. As far as I can see, this is pretty much dealt with and not a problem. So that's why I find it to be somewhat surprising that it's so commonly made this point. Now, I understand this is kind of a pompous claim for me to make, that this is now dealt with, and obviously I need to tread carefully. I mean, surely it can be the case that there are new kind of ways of looking at it, which brings these topics back into question, and that's fine. I acknowledge that. I'm not saying that I know the state of the art of philosophical discourse on this necessarily, but neither do the posts that I've seen on this topic. They just start from the scratch making this simple claim and do not acknowledge the very well-known counter-arguments for these claims. So that's what I'm talking about. So yeah, that's why, because I think it's quite simply false and it's widely propagated, I think it's important to address the issue here. Now, in defense of the people who take this view and maybe make these posts on social media, although I think it's not very debatable, I do acknowledge it's a difficult problem. And it's difficult because it requires us to sort of give up the gut feeling, intuitive thinking, the kind of common sense way of seeing the things, and it requires us to take a step towards abstract thinking, considering abstractions that are not our kind of everyday experience, based on everyday experience, but abstractions, and that is always a bit more difficult. So this is a hard problem to understand, no question about that. And I, for one, it took me a long time to get sort of a good grasp of this situation. And the book that really helped me on this matter was the classic work by C.S. Lewis, The Screwtape Letters. And for those who don't know this book, before I cite a couple of passages from it, it's important to clarify what the nature of the book. So this is a book which is kind of fictional book. Every chapter is a letter from a senior devil to a junior or apprentice devil who is in his apprenticeship trying to convert a Christian man away from God to Satan, something like that. And every letter is from this senior devil to give guidance to the apprentice devil. And that's why, in this book, when this clarification is needed, that when they talk about enemy with a capital E, they're referring to God, because obviously God is the enemy of the devils. So let's see what C.S. Lewis had to say about this topic. So, if you try to explain to him, so this is the Christian man, that men's prayers today are one of the innumerable coordinates with which the enemy harmonizes the weather of tomorrow, he would reply that then, and here comes the important part, the enemy always knew men were going to make those prayers, and if so, they did not pray freely, but were predestined to do so. So this is pretty much C.S. Lewis is actually, I mean, I don't remember now when the book was written, but he's actually making pretty much the same case, because you also see these posts on social media where they are making the point that, well, what's the point in praying? Because, as many atheists think, the purpose of prayer is to change the world somehow, but if everything is predestined, there's no point in praying. And on the other hand, C.S. Lewis goes a bit further and makes the point also that, you know, they are predestined to pray anyways. So what's the point? He's beautifully addressing, acknowledging the issue in this one. And then the next passage, he gives the answer. Creation in its entirety operates at every point of space and time. Then there's a little break. I left a bit out, and then their kind of consciousness, it refers to now human, so their kind of consciousness forces them to encounter the whole self-consistent creative act as a series of successive events. So that was how people encounter, how people perceive the whole creation. And then comes, these are not really the main point of this video now, but they are just so beautiful. Why that creative act leaves room for their free will is the problem of problems, the secret behind the enemy's nonsense about love. So the devil is wondering, and why did God leave room for free will? And he's baffled. To him, this is the problem of problems, and to him it doesn't make any sense. And he says that, you know, somehow this free will is act of God's love, but to the devil this is just nonsense. So I mean, these are actually beautiful passages, really worth thinking carefully. And then comes the important part, actually. How it does so is no problem at all, for the enemy does not foresee the humans making their free contributions in a future, but sees them doing so in his unbounded now. And then the conclusion. And obviously, to watch a man doing something is not to make him do it. The remarkable thing about C.S. Lewis is, and I've heard other people say this, and, you know, after reading this book, for example, can't disagree, that, like, this is a fictional book, and this, with remarkable clarity, in this kind of fictional, almost light-hearted way, he addresses really, truly profound issues, to the extent that this was actually the place which opened my eyes to this problem. So I think it's really beautiful. Now, I say he writes with remarkable clarity. I understand that, you know, taking these passages out of context and all that, or coming out of the blue, it's not that clear, I'm sure, but that's exactly my main point of this video, to explain what C.S. Lewis is saying this. I think this was the letter or chapter 14 of the book, if I remember correctly. It's not an expensive book, a couple of quids, so by all means go and read the book. So, to get into explaining what C.S. Lewis is talking about, we do a little thought experiment here. This is a simplification, a reduction of our universe into the bare minimum in some sense. So this is now a one-dimensional model of the universe. There's a person, one person in this universe, and that person can go either up or down. That's the one dimension, up or down. The time in this case starts from left and ends at the right end. So the horizontal direction is time, and so there are no two dimensions. There's just one spatial dimension, up and down, and then the other one is time. And the assumption for this model is that when you move to the next time step, you either go up or down. In this case, I didn't allow you to stay where you are, but you just go up or down. First we go up, then we go down. And now, in this simplest scenario, we can just say that the decision, whether you go up or down, is dictated by God, let's say. So the person in this universe is completely at the mercy of God, just drifting up and down as God wills. He has no choice himself. He just keeps going up and down, so on. So you can see how this thing proceeds. Going up and down, there seems to be no point. It's completely and aimless. God telling this guy, whether to go up or down. So this scenario has no free will whatsoever. The guy has no saying to this. Now, how do we incorporate free will? And one way to do that is that I would say to you, okay, you now think that you are the person there in that universe, and I give you the option to color some of these squares in this matrix. So now here, every column of this matrix is a moment in time, and you can color in this matrix of these squares one or more or all of them. Nobody's telling you what to do. You are completely free to choose. Some of the squares green, and the point is that if you land on a green square, you go up, and if you land on a black square, you go down. And no one's holding a gun to your head saying that square needs to be green or black. You are completely free to choose the coloring yourself. So, what does this then look like? I mean, I've done the coloring for you. Obviously, the video is not very interactive, so I had to do it for you, but hope you trust me on this. It doesn't really matter what it looks like. I just randomly colored some of them green, so there's sort of roughly the same now. I think actually there are probably fewer green ones, but doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. And now, the way this works, just to clarify, is that we start from a black square, which means that when we move to the next column, next time instant, we go down, like so. And now we landed on a green square, it means we need to go up, like so. And again, down we go, and up we go. And you can see how these colors determine the whole trajectory of the person, how it goes. And since you are the person here, and you got to choose how you color this, in this case, God has no saying to this. It's completely your free will. And you can see how the trajectory formed there. So this is now how you can incorporate free will there. Now, as I said, that this whole concept is quite tricky, and the reason why it is quite tricky is that we somehow have to be able to appreciate this idea. We have to be able to see things from both sort of God's perspective and a human perspective. And of course, we can't see things from God's perspective, and that's why we need to have these abstractions that kind of model the God's perspective. And now actually what we see here is exactly the God's perspective. He sees, as C.S. Lewis put it, everything at one go. He sees the future, he sees the past, he sees the present. And yet, none of these green squares was his choice. It's the person here who chose the colors. So this is the person's free will. But God just sees everything at one go. Now, the tricky thing here is that, okay, we can now see the God's perspective, but what is the human perspective on this then? And it is this. So, for the human, you can only see the present, and the future is hidden. And I think this is actually a very nice example, because even if you yourself chose where the colors are, and you know you put them there, just not being able to see the future makes it all seem very murky and almost sort of claustrophobic. Now, in all fairness, I could have just, for this present time, the starting moment here, I could have just covered all the squares except the one where the guy is. But I thought, it's kind of nice to leave the whole column there, because it kind of illustrates the whole mindset that this man has. Meaning that he can sort of see alternatives, that he knows, I'm starting now from this square, it's black, I'm going down, but had I started one square below, I would be going up. Or if I started from the two from the top, I would be going up, and so on. So we can see that it's not just this present, just this single point that he has in mind. He has some options how things could have been, but now he's in a black square. He decides to go down, and so we move to the next step. And again, we landed on a green square. We should be going up, but we only see the present. We don't see the future. It's debatable whether to see the past. I decided to cover the past as well here, but you could have it. It doesn't really make much difference for the point. And now, when you look at it this way, you understand exactly what C.S. Lewis was saying when he said that their kind of consciousness, the human kind of consciousness, forces them to encounter the whole self-consistent creative act as a series of successive events. Meaning that we know here is underlying the whole big picture of green and black squares. But this is because of the way our consciousness works. We only see one slice at a time, and it gives us this kind of a claustrophobic feeling. And that's where the difference lies. But when we step back to the God's perspective, we see the whole thing, and again we see the passage from C.S. Lewis: the enemy, the God, does not foresee the humans making their free contributions in a future, but he sees them doing so in his unbounded now. So what we see here is the unbounded now that C.S. Lewis is talking about. So, the conclusion of this is that it's all pretty much about the perspective, and the perspective between the divine perspective and the human perspective is largely, the difference comes from the kind of the form of consciousness. Men cannot see the future, God can, but it doesn't mean that the future is predetermined in that sense. So the whole thing is about the point of view or perception, and I can't help but to repeat the beautiful conclusion that C.S. Lewis made. And obviously, to watch a man doing something is not to make him do it. It couldn't be more clear saying that, even if God knows the future, it doesn't mean it's predetermined. It doesn't mean that you don't have free will. Very, very to the point. Now, I will wrap up this thing with few objections that I could imagine people come up with watching this video. And the first one is that, okay, what if I change my mind about the coloring? So I color the whole matrix with green and black, but as the guy starts moving along from the beginning of time to the right end, towards the right end, what if I decided I want to change the colors? But now you are falling into this trap of confusing the abstraction, what is permitted with this abstract model, and your current present physical universe where you are. Because that change of mind that you're now talking about, if you want to change the coloring of the matrix, that change of mind happens in the time of the present physical universe, which is where the time is measured by the little clock ticking on the corner of your screen, presumably. But we can't step outside the model. In the model, the time is the one that goes from left to right, and every column represents a separate moment in time. And if you look at those, you can see that every column has a different coloring. So the columns don't have same squares painted green, which means that actually the person changes their mind from step to step. Is constantly changing their mind. So this is already baked into this model. But you can't. You are breaking the rules if you say, I want to change the rules now outside this model. You are falling into this problem, which I started by saying that this is exactly what makes this very difficult to digest and requires abstract thinking. And this is very much sort of related to the next objection that I could think. That okay, that decisions in this thing were done simultaneously. I had the whole matrix, which I colored some of the squares green, but actually the human perspective is that I go sequentially, column by column, and if that's how I proceed, I might think differently and color them differently. And this is close to what I said earlier. The same mistake is happening here, because you are kind of confusing what you can do outside this example and what's permitted inside this example, and this is quite tricky to understand, I'm sure. But maybe the best way of thinking about this is that if instead of saying that you decide which squares to color, you do it by tossing a coin, heads or tails, green or black. So obviously it should be the case that it doesn't matter if you toss the coin in advance to color the whole thing, or you toss the coin as you go. It doesn't matter. The way the coin behaves is the same. Of course, the coin is not now some sort of intelligent being with its own mind. No, not at all. But still, the point is that whether we know the whole sequence in advance or not, it doesn't affect the behavior of the coin, which is exactly the same thing as in this model. That if God knows what we're going to do, it doesn't mean that just knowing what we're going to do, it doesn't mean that he predestines us to do so. So it's a tricky thing. I fully acknowledge it's hard to explain. I think the coin example is the best way to grasp this. But I think that if you incline to take this point, you are making the mistake of mixing again the physical world. Because the point is that in this physical world, so I've colored the squares the way I've done, but now if I were to do it sequentially, I would end up doing a different coloring. And even if I did try to do the coloring 10 times, I probably wouldn't do, because I did it all every time kind of arbitrarily. I probably wouldn't be reproducing the same coloring multiple times. But that's because I am doing it in this physical world, and my mind is slightly different state after now than it is 1 minute from now, and I end up doing something different. So yes, that would happen. But the point is that again, you are then mixing the thing that and change in one's mind that happen in this physical world, and that's not permitted because we are only confined to this restricted thought experiment where the time only goes from left to right according to the columns. The next one is then kind of, I could see that the kind of follow-up point from the previous two is that, well, this is a false analogy. Universe is not this simplistic. Universe is far more complicated, and this doesn't prove this doesn't prove anything. And you'd be absolutely right. This is that this is not an accurate representation of how the universe works. But we have to be clear. If my point was to have some sort of an abstraction that helps us to solve the problem of evil, or whether abortion is right or wrong, or whatever, solve any question, this probably wouldn't be the example to make. This doesn't address that problem. But the purpose of this is to address the claim that God's omniscience implies that there's no free will, and therefore I don't need to have a perfect model of the universe, which no one would be able to produce anyways. I don't need to have a perfect model. All I need to do is sufficiently accurate analog that addresses these points. And what I need to do also is not to provide an accurate model, but a counterexample. And that's all I need to do. And I think, as far as I can tell, this is sufficient as a counterexample. Now, I'm not saying I'm infallible. Of course, we all make mistakes. I overlook certain things, and I'm happy to be corrected. Let me know in the comments if you think this is not sufficient as a sort of a proxy for the purpose of being a counterexample. But if the comment is just saying that this is not how universe works, then that's a bit obvious. Of course it isn't, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't make sense here. Now, again, kind of next natural objection would be that, okay, well, this is just some trickery, but in the end this doesn't prove that free will exists, that there is free will. And you'd be absolutely right again. It doesn't. This whole video is not about whether there is free will or not. I'm not making that point. Obviously, I have my views on that, but when it comes to this video, it might just as well be that there is no free will. The only point this video is making, that if there is no free will, it's not because God is omniscient. So the only point I'm trying to address here is that the claim that from God's omniscience that implies that there's no free will, and therefore Christianity is self-refuting, that's my only point. And then pretty much the last thing is that I could imagine some people saying, okay, well, whatever. Bible still causes problems with free will because Bible does not permit free will. So you still have an issue with free will in Christianity. And the common example people raise is the God hardening Pharaoh's heart in Exodus. So God is basically, this is kind of read as God hardening Pharaoh's heart, meaning that God doesn't believe, and therefore because God made the Pharaoh not believe, then God can punish him for not believing, and so on. And the other example I've heard raised is that, if we have free will, but then if we choose not to believe in Jesus, we end up spending eternity in hell. How is that free will? And these are fair points. I'm not dismissing them, but and to be honest, I don't think these are particularly difficult points to sort of answer either. But that's not the topic for this video, and this is long enough now. So I don't wish to sort of pursue these questions now. Maybe it's a topic for a later video. I certainly don't have any problem with this, but I'm not addressing these now. So I think that pretty much wraps up everything I had to say. So God bless you all.